Hey, good morning, shuttle fans. My name's Andy Foster. I'm an ex-control propulsion instructor and ascent abort specialist. Um, we're going to here today to talk about space shuttle ascent aborts, and me in particular, TALs or Transoceanic Abort Landings. And so, just to start off here, this is who I am. From 1984 to 94, I was control propulsion instructor for the astronauts and flight controllers. And the control prop guys on a shuttle mission simulator team were the guys that taught main engines, orbital maneuvering system, reaction control system, flight control system. Uh, in addition to that, we did the dynamic flight stuff, primarily ascent and entry, just a little bit of orbit, uh, but and we specialize sometimes in the aborts and contingency aborts and manually flying the stuff and ascent guidance and entry guidance and all that kind of thing. Um, During the last 4 years I was there from 1994, my sole job was ascent abort specialist, and so specialized in ascent aborts and contingency aborts, putting up all those briefings around here. Hopefully you'll see them on video. And went to various abort panels and flight techniques meetings as a training rep. And then kind of as an aside, I left NASA for about 4 years, came back in 97, and from there to the end of the program, I was in shuttle flight operations safety, and most of that time I was the lead engineer for that group on the contractor side, and attended all kinds of various panels and that kind of thing. So I have a deep love and appreciation for the shuttle, and that's why I'm essentially doing these briefings. So today we're specializing in transoceanic abort landings, but we are going to talk about what intact aborts are and why they existed quickly. We're going to talk about the flight profiles, kind of brush over what each type of intact abort was, talk a little bit about how failures related to doing an intact abort. We're going to talk a little bit about the risks for each one of these. We're going to talk about TAL in particular today. The other risks you can see we'll just mention, but if you want more details, go to the videos on those particular aborts. And then I'm going to show you the procedures and how the crew executed these aborts. So to start off, what was an intact abort? Well, essentially it's a flight profile flown during ascent because you've either lost a main engine or partial loss of main engine. There could be other system failures that would drive that, but those were the ones that when we did all the analysis that supported the flight, that we actually designed the flight profiles to fit. Loss of a thrust of a main engine or partial. And it would always result in either going to orbit and getting into a safe one, or landing somewhere either across the ocean or back in the U.S. And that's why it was called an intact abort. Got everything back in one piece, got the crew back in one piece, and turn around and fly the orbiter again, supposedly. And so the types of intact aborts were return to launch site, transoceanic abort landings, which started off as transatlantic abort landings until we're going to fly off the west coast, and the name changed and we never went back. And then abort to orbit, abort once around. Now, if you look on the graphic here, you'll see that I've got all the various profiles up here. And if we were talking about liftoff to orbit, we'd just be going along this top line right here. And so the very first abort that you have available to you, and the only one you can do for about the first 2.5 minutes, but you could do it up to about the first 4 minutes, was return to the launch site. And a big loop here, not quite like an airplane flies it, but the trajectory shape is like a loop, and put you back at the Cape. The next one available to us, and one we're going to talk about today, is called a TAL, essentially a lob of the orbiter across the ocean to land somewhere in France or Africa, places like that. The next type of orbit, in the one you'd really like to fly, and the only one that we actually did fly, which was abort to orbit, would put you in 105 nautical mile circular orbit. That'd give you a safe orbital stay time of 24 hours without having to do anything else, and you can go up and figure out what you could do, what you didn't have to do, and whether you need to come home or whether you could stay up and do your mission. And then, of course, the last intact abort we're going to talk about is an abort once around. And abort once around can be executed either from a nominal ascent because you needed to come home, you just turned around, did a deorbit burn, or you could do one from an abort to orbit. And again, that's covered in a separate briefing and a separate video. This chart here, we show the various kind of representative trajectories that that we flew during the shuttle program. This is 28.5 degree, which were the early parts of the program, the most efficient trajectory you could fly from the Cape. And you can see we put the tail sights right along the trajectory. This is essentially Dakar, Senegal, YOF, Banjul, and then Ben Guerier's up here. And these were the tail sights that we used. These the very first part of the program, just down here. And then a little bit later, while we're still flying 28.5 degree, we'd actually go up here to Ben Guerier. And that was kind of forced by the political situation down here in Africa. But most of the program that most people are familiar with, which was ISS, the tail sites were up here in this region. We'll talk about those in a little more detail. And then for abort once around, you either came back to the Cape or Edwards, depending on the weather and what part of the program you're in. We first started, of course, landing always at Edwards, and then eventually started landing back at KSC all the time. And we had Northrop, which we landed at for STS-3, and we only did that one time and got so much gypsum in the vehicle, nobody ever wanted to go back again. Okay, so why do we have intact aborts? And that's because the space shuttle program had a requirement that said, if we lose an engine or partial loss of thrust from an engine, we need to be able to return the orbiter and crew safely. And so that's what drove the whole thing. Very early, like STS-1, you had RTLS and ATO and AOA. We used something called abort shafting, where the trajectory was really lofted. TAL didn't exist for STS-1, but came in fairly quickly, as we'll talk about in just a second after that. And actually for STS-126, we also used an abort shape trajectory where you had ATO/AOA capability pretty early. And that's why the next bullet says when the program started, you had RTLS, ATO, and AOA. And those were your intact abort modes. TAL capability, like a lot of the contingency aborts, which is talked about in a separate video, was discovered by the crews getting in the simulators going, what if, and then figuring out what they could do. And Joe Engel and Richard Truly were training for their flight, and they did a 3-engine out abort to Rota, which is in Spain. And once they figured out how to do it, they essentially wrote the procedures in the cue cards for STS-2, and then the program started working on it because it looked like a really good idea. And we automated it from STS-3 and then had it in the flight software as an automated procedure from then on till the end of the program. When you start talking about intact abort modes, and you talk about to most ops guys about it, they're going to think RTLS, TAL, and ATO primarily. And the reason for that, which I'll explain in a few minutes, had to do with how hard it was to get into an ATO, at least later in the program. So what determined which intact abort you flew was the timing, type, and severity of the failure, how much performance you had left, and if you were landing, what the landing conditions were at the abort site. Though that would tend to drive which abort site you picked if you had several of them available to you. And as an example of how timing played into this, and because we're talking about intact aborts, they were defined by an engine out, I'm going to use an engine in these examples. So if you have an engine out at liftoff, man, what are you doing? RTLS only. That's all you have. You don't have the performance to do anything else. But about 3 minutes down the line for nearly every flight, if you had an engine out, you were going to go TAL, because TAL was safer than RTLS. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. On another flight, that 4-minute engine out would result in a TAL, but on a slightly different one, because it had more performance, that engine out at 4 minutes might take you all the way uphill. And it varied from flight to flight because we were carrying different payloads, and that would drive how much performance you had available to you to do these aborts. And so the abort boundaries would often shift a little bit. So the same failure on one flight might do one thing and on another. And of course, if you start talking about anything other than engine outs, it really is timing, type, and severity. In other words, if I start talking a cabin leak and I got a little tiny one, and then it's going to let you stay up for a long time, you might do an AOA, you might do a TAL, or you might do an RTLS, depending on how long, before the cabin actually totally depressurizes and you start having issues. So in terms of risk, as most people know, the RTLS was the riskiest abort, though the risk was actually overhyped in most cases. And go look at the RTLS video and you can hear that discussion. TAL was the next safest abort, And then, of course, ATO was the safest of all. The AOA risk tended to vary, and it kind of depended on the type of AOA that you could do. One was called steep, one was called shallow. If it's a steep, that was kind of along the lines of an ATO risk because you had just a nominal entry and some kind of initial initial piece of it being up at normal orbital altitudes. But a shallow, which involved a lot more time in the atmosphere and that kind of thing, would heat the orbiter up a lot worse than a towel even. And so it was very thermally severe. And so that risk was significantly higher due to the extra thermal loads. If you had abort capability overlap, and if you looked at that first graphic that I showed you, what you actually would have seen, if you look close, is that the RTLS and TAL lines actually overlap. For most missions, there was an overlap. In other words, I could do RTLS out to the first 4 minutes. I picked up TAL at 2 minutes and 15 seconds. Then from there to the 4-minute boundary, I had RTLS TAL overlap. There's always usually TAL and ATO overlap. TAL actually existed, as I'll talk about in a minute, till very late in the trajectory, and even then there were manual procedures you could use to kind of force yourself into a TAL if you really needed to go execute one. But when we talk about powered flights abort, most of the time when you talk to ops guys that were involved with shuttles, they're going to think you're talking RTLS, TAL, and ATO, and just be aware of that. Okay, getting into an AOA, generally, it really took a lot more than a single engine out. You could get there by multiple engine outs going uphill, but generally it was systems failures and very significant system failures that it would take to drive you into getting into an abort once around. And again, there's going to be a video on ATO and AOA, and I'll talk about that in more detail there. So I showed you this. These are all the different TAL contingency sites around the world, landing sites that we had. And the ones that we used primarily for TAL were Zaragoza, Benguerir, and Morón. This one is off a little bit. The red circle should be a little bit further northeast, but it's trying to show you Zaragoza. And then Morón, which was just still in Spain, but a little further southwest. And then, and of course, Benguerir, which was in northern Africa. And those 3 TAL sites we tended to use quite a bit for a lot of the program. For a small part of the program, especially in the ISS era, we had Le Tube, France, as one of our TAL sites. But again, it kind of depended on what part of the program you were talking about. And then, of course, early on, when we were flying a lot of 28.5-degree trajectories, which almost never happened once we got into the ISS era, we had Dakar, Senegal, and then Banjul down here off the African coast that we would fly to. So we're going to talk about the TAL calls or the abort calls that you would hear. How did the crew know that they had TAL underneath them? Well, the ground would call them up and give them a call, and that call would be 2-engine TAL, and we'll show you a little more about that. That told the crew that if you lose the main engine right here, you can just go TAL and you can make it. Usually you get TAL capability right after staging at 2 minutes and 15 to 2 minutes and 30, maybe a little later in some flights, but that's a general range for when it would happen. And when the call would go up to the crew, it would be 2 engines. There goes Morón, Le Tube, for instance. In other words, it would be 2 engine and then the name of the TAL site. And if you look at the 2-engine Zaragoza call up here, it's saying at 6,000 feet per second inertial velocity, anything past that point, you have TAL capability. This is out of the checklist. This is what the crew would use if they lost comm with the ground. They would know that they had 2-engine TAL at 6,000 feet per second or later. Now, the other call that were kind of related to that you would hear if you were going uphill on a nominal ascent is negative return. Remember I talked about that RTLS and TAL overlap? Negative return was telling them you no longer have RTLS capability underneath you. You're so far downrange that you don't have the performance to get back. And so at that point, if an engine went out, you only had TAL underneath you. But really, it was more of a player for different types of systems failures where you needed a fast return to the ground. You lost the RTLS option. It took about 10 to 15 minutes more to do a TAL than it did an RTLS. So what I've got on this slide, if you look, the white line here is essentially a 51.6 representative trajectory to go into ISS. And then the red line here is the powered flight TAL trajectory, and then the green line is the entry trajectory for TAL. And this is a representative trajectory going to Zaragoza. So the very first thing that would happen when the crew boarded TAL is two things. The TAL flag would get set in the software, actually three things, and then the ohms dump would start. And when we talk about an ohms dump starting, what we're talking about, not like an airplane, we're just dumping propellant overboard, we're actually burning it. In this case, we're burning it through the 2 ohms engines and 24 RCS jets in the aft. And that I'll get into in a few minutes, is to get the vehicle in below tank landing constraints. It has to do more with the entry side than the ascent side, but getting the weight off the vehicle does improve main engine performance and helps you get to the TAL target. So there are multiple benefits in doing it. The other thing that would happen is, because the TAL site is over here to the south of the nominal trajectory, the vehicle would yaw steer toward the target, called the range velocity target, which was the MECO point. And we would call that IY steering or inertial yaw. And that would start immediately. The vehicle would yaw out and start heading for the RV line target. And I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. I'll remember right now. And so we're steering to the RV line target. RV stands for range velocity. It's this kind of point in the sky, a certain range from the site with a certain velocity, a certain altitude, all designed to get the orbiter to a safe landing at the TAL site. And it was actually designed so that the cutoff for what occurred, it didn't point you exactly at the TAL site. It pointed you on a line that was tangent to a 500 nautical mile circle, because the orbiter could fly that out, and that let you get off the tank a little bit earlier than you would have had. It would have taken more performance to get there, which would affect your abort boundaries. So we kind of designed it so that we could steer out a little bit of cross range and get the abort boundaries earlier. And so the other thing that would happen, you just fly along trying to get climbing up to your RV target. We'll talk about where the MECO point was in a minute. But when you hit an inertial velocity of 15,400 feet per second, we would roll the vehicle to heads up. And the reason we're doing that is twofold. The real reason that it's happening is that during this climb up in the atmosphere, the tank is heating up, and we're actually at a relatively flat flight path angle, are going to be here at MECO. And so and we're going to shut off a lot earlier, and the tank's going to be closer to the vehicle as it plunges into the atmosphere, because it just doesn't have the lofting to shoot it real far away. And so we are trying to even out the heating on the external tank and keep it from creating hot spots, which will cause it to explode when we don't want it to. And so that was done at 15,400 feet per second VI, and it had a secondary benefit in that the orbiter was above the tank, and that we didn't have to maneuver to get the orbiter essentially heads up for the entry into the atmosphere, because once you got here and you shut off your main engines, you were going to need flight control within 3 minutes. If you didn't have it, you were going to lose the vehicle. So main engine cutoff would be roughly around 24,000 feet per second inertial velocity. When I first started working, the MECO altitude was around 330,000 feet. It got moved up to 360, and that has to do with the tank and wanting to get away from it, which I'll talk about more in a minute. And then once you shut the main engines off, you separate it from the external tank, the RCS jets would fire and push the orbiter straight up, what we call -C direction, until it hit 11 feet per second, and then it would shut down. And then the crew would essentially command the software to pull in the entry stuff, which is in what we call Ops 3 software. And it would immediately load Ops 3 and then go to the entry mode, or Ops 304. And with the TAL flag set, which had happened when I selected TAL in the first place, it would cause the software to start dumping ohms propellant again out of just the 2 ohms engines. This is a propulsive dump, and the reason that you're doing it is because, as I mentioned, you're heating the tank up, you're a lot slower, it's going to be closer to you, it's going to come down into the atmosphere. This RV line target was designed so that the tank stayed off all these land masses over here to protect these people. And so there was a risk that this thing was going to blow up actually at a distance that would put the orbiter at risk. And so what we did was we fired these OMS engines essentially to create separation from the tank and put it into essentially a statistically safe zone. And the other thing that was a little bit different, when we first started doing TALs, we would pitch up to alpha 40 just like we would for a nominal entry. But as we got our thermal analysis refined and realized it, because the flight path angle is flat and the velocity is a little below orbit, which is what you want to land, this thing does a little bit of a pull out. It actually increases entry heating during that pull out. And so we added another 3 degrees to the angle of attack, mainly to protect the tail, but also to help with the wing leading edge temperatures. And then once it went through this little pull out, and wasn't high G or anything, just kind of a little pull out, then it would fly like it would for a nominal entry, which was an Ops 3 Mach alpha range profile using bank to control drag and cross range. So some of this I've already gone over, but once the TAL abort was declared, we steered toward the site. We did the OMS dump to reduce landing weight, get below tank landing constraints. Actually helped your performance a little bit too. And we talked about how the TAL trajectory was close to nominal, but the shutoff was much earlier. For a nominal cutoff, you'd usually see 25,000, 5 to 8, somewhere in that range of thousands of feet per second. And we cut off around 24 for an auto TAL. At 360,000 feet late in the program. Talked about the heads-up roll, why we do that, delayed ET rupture, cut the time to get the orbiter entry attitude, got the Ops 3 software, had only 3 minutes before he hit the atmosphere. Now, what we didn't talk about in that other drawing was this, and you can fly a TAL with 2 or 3 engines. Typically, if it was a 2-engine well, of course, it's because you don't have the performance to do anything else, and so you're going to do the TAL. If you were flying a TAL 3 engine, it was probably for a systems case. In other words, you had a cabin leak or some other kind of failure, perhaps propellant leaks or something like that, that made it so you did not want to go to orbit and you wanted to get the orbiter on the ground in about 35 to 40 minutes. There was no appreciable difference in the trajectory. It flew it the same way if you were a 2 or 3 engine. TAL always had to be initiated, like all the intact aborts, by the crew. The auto TAL, with what I'll show you in a few minutes, something called the abort rotary switch, could be done up to 23,000 feet per second. So real late in the trajectory, you can still rotate the button, hit the button, and off you'd go. But we also had a lot of TAL variants, which gave us a lot of capability. And some of those were performed by shutting down the main engines manually at certain velocities to put you in a window to a site. And then you select the TAL post MECO, and those were called late TALs. I'm not going to talk about those in this briefing. There will be another video briefing where I'm going to talk about high energy, low energy, and actually what we call TAL droop contingency scenarios. So be sure, if you're interested in learning more about those, to go to that briefing. But today we're just going to talk about what I'd call a nominal TAL, auto TAL. So we did ET-SEP maneuver, 11 feet per second away from the vehicle, going straight up. The pass software mode's major mode 104, but that is an orbital mode. It doesn't have much flight control, RCS only. The crew would check their attitude, make sure that the vehicle was pointed where they wanted to be pointed, and then we had low rates. And if it was good, then they would type in a command that said Ops 301 Pro to the pass software. And that would pull in the entry software, and because the TAL flag would be set, it would immediately jump into 304 because it knew you needed to get the entry flight control right away. That would also close the ET umbilical doors that were still open. That's where those big feed lines from the external tank had been going through, and you got TPS towels in the bottom, so you want to get those closed. Talked about the OMS dump. That also happens automatically to get you away from the external tank. And what I didn't talk about, there's also an RCS dump. That was really just to get the RCS tanks below a tank landing constraint. And then after that initial 43-degree alpha to give us a little bit of thermal protection with a really small pullout, then we'd fly down to alpha 40 and then Mach alpha down to the landing site. Well, believe it or not, you're looking at the procedure pages here for the crew. And on the left side, you see all the procedures that the commander needed and all the procedures that the pilot needed. And for most of your intact aborts, except for the contingency aborts, these were in what we called the flip books, and they were Velcroed up in the windows. And so the crew could just reach up and flip to whatever page they needed. But if you go back, you could actually correlate most of the stuff you're seeing here um, with something that I showed you on the graphic, other than the entry stuff, which I haven't talked in detail, and actually I'm probably not going to here, other than right here, almost down PT doors, and the rest of this I'm not going to address. I talked to you about the lots of different types of towels, the low energy, high energy, and you can see them all here. Again, I'm going to cover those in a separate video. The cases that we're talking about today are the auto towels, and that's in the white areas. And these are different towel sites that you could possibly select or have selected, and where the velocity would have to be able to, these would be the MECO velocity cutoffs, would take you to those sites if you had them selected, if they're auto towel. If they're late towel, you're looking in there shutting the engines down, or if the engine shut down on you, you might look in here and say, oh, I could do a towel here. Okay, so now we talked about what I would call kind of nominal towels. What if you start off on a towel, and actually there's a second case. If I'm going uphill and I lose 2 engines, what do I do? Well, if you're lucky, you have towel capability underneath you. You're really lucky, you go uphill. But that's really pretty late before you have that capability. The other case is I start off on a towel, now I lose an engine. What do I do? Well, in both cases of just losing 2 simultaneously, going uphill or starting off on a towel and then having an engine go out, there's something we would call single engine towel completions. And it's just telling you that once you're past that certain point, and we would track it by, again, velocity, you could still complete the towel using completely nominal procedures. And so this is, first you're seeing the single engine Zaragoza 104 on the left. Now you'd hear that towel just on a nominal ascent. That's telling the crew that if you lose 2 engines at 14,300 feet per second or later, up to here to up until you get single engine press, which is a little later, you would do a towel. And in this case, you do a towel to Zaragoza. Over here on the right side, these single engine completion numbers are for single engine completions after I start off on a towel when I've already lost an engine. Okay, in other words, and I'll show you how the crew figures that out. The ground would call, you see those little blocks over on the right, those are numbers that you write in the checklist, and I'll show you they had the ground would call those up, but in case you went no com, we had a card in the checklist called a redes card. And the way you would use it, let's say that Zaragoza is your towel site for today. And so if I have my first engine down at 6,900 feet per second and I start off on a towel, I can pull up this card and I can complete single engine once I get past 15.4. Now, there was some capability to try to get to the towel site past this other single engine ops 3 call. I'm not going to talk about those in this briefing, but essentially before 11.3 and between 6.9 and 11.3, you had to do a contingency abort, which I cover in the contingency abort video. But if you got to 15.4, you lost another engine or later, you could just keep on pressing to your towel site. And so they had these numbers on board, again, in case they went no com. Ground would tell you what they really were based on your real performance. We'll mention this for single engine ops 3. I'm not going to go into detail here. Again, there will be a separate high energy, low energy towel and single engine ops 3 video. We call these droop cases. But it defined a point in the trajectory where if you lost 2 main engines, you could throttle the remaining engine up to 109 and you could still use ops 3 and you could make it over to your landing site. Again, just like the single engine Zaragoza call, if I'm going uphill and I lose 2 engines, I could do that essentially throttle up the remaining one to 109 here at 12.1 or later, between 12.1 and 12 and 14.3, and I'd throttle up that remaining main engine to 109, and I'd press and try to see if I could get probably to Zaragoza. For these other aborts, again, just like I just showed you, you go look up that number on the redes card. And so if you start off on a TAL and your first engine out, you find that on the card, and then you could look up, and actually they'd look up this single engine ops 3 value and the single engine completion value, and they'd write those down on their checklist as soon as they had started off actually on the TAL. Okay. I'm just going to mention this. This was an operational technique developed in 1999. I actually had a hand with this. I was working with John Young in the SCS. And John always was a big proponent of maintaining 2 engine out coverage for contingency aborts. As I mentioned earlier, when you go off on an intact TAL, the vehicle immediately starts steering off to the east. That pulls you away from those East Coast landing sites where if I had a second engine go out, you'd have some capability to try to land at. So John wanted to find out if there was a way where you could still do a TAL and then still maintain 2 engine out contingency coverage as long as possible. And so the solution actually was very simple, and it was simply not to abort TAL, even though the engine went out, and even though you knew you were going to do it, you just sat on it for a while and didn't do anything. And when you actually decided to abort TAL was a little bit complicated. The ground had to help you with it. The ground would have their tools running, and they would be able to tell you when they wanted you to abort. And what they were protecting was that single engine ops 3 call. And then we always held back some main engine performance that we called a flight performance reserve. And of course, we managed these things statistically. So when you were starting to hit 3 sigma FPR or flight performance reserve for the TAL, that was the point where you're starting to actually endanger completing the TAL. And so we would tell them abort TAL now. And this was called delayed TAL. This was actually, we put it in our pockets as an operational technique starting in 1999. The advantage to it, of course, as I mentioned, the whole goal was to keep the vehicle closer to the East Coast of the United States. It enabled you to possibly fly a 2 engine out East Coast abort landing, which I talk about in the contingency abort briefing. But there was a cost, and the cost was that, remember we talked just a minute ago about those single engine TAL completions? Well, it delayed them. And so that was the cost that you were paying. You were biasing, if you want to say biasing your aborts to say that if we're going to have a second engine failure, we believe they're going to occur earlier than later. And that's really what you were trading off by doing this technique. So just to talk about the overall risk picture and the intact aborts, the pros for a TAL was that if you started off on one, you had a lot of options. If a second or third engine went out, you're much more likely to survive it. There were fewer black zones. You had lots of things you could do, including what we called stretch entry capabilities, where you reduced angle of attack, and you could actually stretch the range out over a nominal. The downside of a TAL was that if you had some kind of thermal problem with the vehicle, in other words, you were concerned about wing leading edge tiles or something like that, where TAL's doing a nominal entry, that's really close to 3,000 degrees on the wing leading edges. The stretch cases where you lower the angle of attack could be even slightly higher than that, and they would also start heating up thermal tiles on the tail. And so the thermal environment was really harsh compared to RTLS. And so if you had something that you wanted to avoid getting into that really high thermal environment, and you had RTLS and TAL overlap, you could pick RTLS and avoid it completely. With all the other things that were going on with RTLS, that had to be let's just say, a very complicated decision. Also, the other disadvantage to a TAL, especially in the winter, large parts of the trajectory over the North Atlantic, long search and rescue times, very hostile environment. If the crew had to bail out, winter survival time in the waters, it could be extremely limited, even with survival gear. Um, the other piece, of course, as I mentioned, the Ops 1 to 3 transition had to be timely because you had no real flight control in Ops 1 once you hit the atmosphere. And of course, there was a possibility of debris strike from the ET, which was going to erupt closer to you than, much closer to you than nominal ascent. It's no problem at all. You're way away from it. But for a TAL, you were close enough where there was an issue. So how did the crew execute these aborts? Well, first of all, they weren't going to just do it for no reason. Uh, but they waited for 2 commands for the ground for the most part, unless they were no comm. They would get a voice command that would say abort RTLS, abort TAL, whatever. And if abort TAL, they're probably going to tell you where to. And then I'll show you the abort light, which was actually part of the abort rotary push button system. They would light that up. And so you would hear 2 commands from the ground. In other words, you get a confirming cue that the ground wants you to abort. If you're no-comm, you just knew if an engine went out and it went out at a certain velocity, you use your checklist and figure out what abort you have under you. You pick the safest one and off you go. Yeah. So we talked about the abort rotary. This is what it looked like here. This is one of the displays. And then here's your abort rotary switch down here. And you select the abort by just simply rotating the switch into a position, RTLS left, ATO, and TAL over to the right. And then once you select your abort, and it would be confirmed by both the pilot and the MS2, then when you got ready to go, you would push that button, and that is also where the abort light was. And so you push the light, so to speak, and that would set you off on the abort, whichever one you had selected. You had a backup in case that little abort rotary switch failed and didn't work. Essentially, that was you could use Spec 51, which was a software display. And if I wanted to go TAL, for instance, I would type in item 1 execute, and it would select the TAL, and item 3 execute, and it would abort. If I wanted to do an ATO, I could do an item 2 execute and an item 3 execute, and it would abort. If I want to do RTLS, you can see it's not up there. You just typed Ops 601 Pro into the PAF software scratch pad, and boom, off you went. And so this is just a nice little chart that kind of shows you how the intact and contingency aborts play together for this particular mission. This is 114, actually. This is where you can contact me for any questions that you might have, and hope you enjoyed the briefing and that you'll come back and see some more. Thanks.